This is Future Sense Now, where we explore the landscape and byways of our shared futures. Future Sense Now is brought to you by the Futures Forum. Stay tuned for a journey to the future with host Dr. Claire Nelson.
How will we share our future? People always find it easier to be a result of the past as opposed to being a cause for the future. The thing is, as Evelyn Toffler said, change is not only a necessity of life, change is life. Or, as Octavia Butler in her famous book, Parable of the Sower said, Earth seed, all that you touch, you change. All that you change, changes you. The only lasting truth is change. God is change. As we think about Earth Day and we think about the need to move towards a sustainable future, we must bear in mind that any sustainable future, as Sustainable Development Goal 17 says, requires a partnership of government, private sector, and civil society. And that requires a huge transformation in the way we think about life, sustainability, and the future. Joining me in this edition on Future Sense Now will be authors Rick Smyre and RIchardson, who will talk about preparing for a world that doesn't exist yet, and indeed creating the second Enlightenment. Stay tuned for Future Sense Now. Greetings and welcome to another edition of Future Sense Now, where we explore the landscape and byways of our emerging future. This month, April, it's been a month of certainly a lot of activity around the world we see, and more importantly, the global day we all focused on was Earth Day, which is April 22nd. So we are now talking to some people around the country, the United States of America, who are engaged in different ways in thinking about the Earth from the perspective of its sustainability. So our conversation will focus on the future of sustainability. Now, I'll be speaking to Rick Smyre, who is the co-founder of Communities of the Future, who we unfortunately don't have on camera, and RIchardson, a member of the Communities of the Future, who is also engaged in work at the University of the District of Columbia. But more importantly, in this conversation, we want to focus on their groundbreaking work preparing for a world that doesn't exist yet. I think that for most of us, certainly those of us in the Washington, D.C. area, engaged in planning and looking at the various catastrophes around the world, especially the floods, etc., and talking about the climate march that's upcoming, we certainly need better help in preparing for a world that doesn't exist yet. So I want to thank them for joining me and jump right into it. I remember meeting Rick and hearing about the Communities of the Future some 10 years ago when they were doing a workshop at the World Future Society conference. And so, Rick, why don't you start by telling us a little bit about the Communities of the Future?
Surely will. Thank you, Claire. It's a pleasure to be with you. It's hard for me to remember. It's been so many years, Claire, and I say that tongue-in-cheek wise. It's been about 28 years since we founded Communities of the Future, and it emerged from a meeting that 13 of us had from North and South Carolina that met in Wilmington on the coast for a weekend, and we played various roles, such as the head of the State Chamber for South Carolina, the head of Educational TV for South Carolina. I came from the business community. We had 3 from Bell South, had a woman who was a nationally known educator from Raleigh. And so we spent the whole weekend just talking about how can we, in fact, interest local leaders in local communities to think about the future in different ways. What were the emerging trends and what might be some of the impact on the trends? We came to the conclusion as a part of that weekend that we needed to expand and connect and really think about the future in different ways. So over a period of the next 4 years, we met every 3 months. And in 1993, we created what was called the Center for Communities of the Future, which was a network of people. We decided to organize it very differently. And we did not provide a funding base for it. We worked out of our homes, those of us that were a part of developing the original idea. And over the next 15 years or so, we met in different places and made presentations throughout the country at the request of various organizations like the Institute for Economic Development based at the University of Oklahoma. And then at the World Future Society meeting in 1999, I met a wonderful colleague who is a colleague to this day, a couple of them from Scotland. They invited me to go over and present these ideas at Edinburgh and Glasgow, which I did and enjoyed it very much. And so over a period of the next 10 years, there were a number of 6 ideas that began to take form, Claire. And they are the 6 chapters in the book. The first chapter is a new approach to the concept of the way in which you look at the philosophic set of ideas. We call it the second Enlightenment. That's a play on the first Enlightenment, which is about 250 years old. Then there's the various different ideas that are emerging, and all of our work is research and development, thinking about what does it mean to be in a leadership capacity in a world in constant change. How do you create capacities for transformation, for education, so that you are really preparing students and those at any age, whether it be a virtual community or a university or a community college or a public or a public school system? How do you prepare them to identify weak signals, emerging trends, and think about what really are going to be the true transformations in our society and economy? And
I want to stop right there and kind of bring Neil in, because Neil actually is sort of working in that space. And I don't know how long, Neil, you've been involved in the committees of the future, but I'm hearing there, and having certainly looked at the book and re-looking at the book, this idea of, first of all, an organic network of people without an official center located in an official physical location. And right there, we're hearing, in other words, a precursor in the early 90s of what is now very much the sort of organic movement sprouting up around different issues which are global. So starting from small communities, we recognize that every global agenda is lived at a local level. You are in Washington, D.C., which is both a local city and a global city. And you're also in a university. What sort of led you to become more engaged in this process? And how do you see, from a university perspective, a small university that is still grappling with getting its feet in the door? How do you see your role in bringing the idea? And I think the idea in this case is what? A future forward college or future forward learning community?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I'm real happy to be here with you and Rick today. It's exciting to be here in Washington, D.C., working on ideas around education and transformation. I do think the University of the District of Columbia is still sort of setting its foundation to really confront the new ways that education needs to happen. I think fundamentally, if we're going to have a community, we're going to have a District of Columbia, if we're going to have a country and a civilization that's going to thrive, we need to shift education from teaching primarily history to using history as a context and learning and creating teachers and learning systems that prepare students and people to begin thinking about the future. There was a recent poll that I saw in one of the magazines recently, where 53% of Americans say they don't think of the future at all or very much. I think that's scary to me. I think we need to fundamentally shift that, and I think that universities and particularly community colleges that are really based at the local level have an excellent opportunity to do that. And it's certainly one of the things that we're hoping to use here at the University of the District of Columbia and Community College.
So your book talks about then some new ideas. For example, so the Future Forward University, it talks about teaching connective thinking. It talks about creating a future forward workforce. How could you explain to me a little bit more and our listeners this idea then of using what you have learned out of the communities of the future coming together and now begin to move that into an institutional space using the community colleges, which sometimes are much more flexible, and creating sort of a learning community college that can begin to kind of, you know, exponentially create this space. Rick, I know you were doing some work in this area. What can you tell us about where we are with that process?
Claire, over the last 5 years, we've been working with the largest community college in North Carolina in Raleigh, and the president of the college at the Wake Tech Community College coined the term Future Forward College. And this idea is built around the framework of the concept that we developed called transformational learning. How do you create new ideas? If the world's going to be constantly changing, reflecting what Neil just said and thinking about the future, and how do we get students and citizens of all ages to be able to identify the emerging ideas and concepts that are just beginning to develop so that we can then work with those ideas and not work with obsolete ideas. Quick example, go back to the 1989 to 92 period. You had ideas like nanotechnology, what now is called 3D printing. Back then it was called rapid prototyping, and it became additive manufacturing. Complete change in how manufacturing is going to be done in the future. The concepts and the technology with regard to the web. The internet's been around since 1969 as a platform, but the web only came about, the graphical interface, in the early 90s. So these were ideas that nobody really knew about except for the people working on them. And now, 25 to 30 years later, they're at the core of the way in which our society and economy is developing. So we're developing a network of community colleges to include Wake Tech in Raleigh, Tarrant County College out in Texas, Neil's at UDCCC in Washington, D.C., and then we have other individuals and small groups at other community colleges. And the idea is to share with each other and actually evolve totally new concepts of how you create a learning experience. I've got an example of that later on if you would like for me to introduce it, because it's just very different from the way we focus on content of learning and then determining and evaluating by tests as to whether we've learned that content. That'll still be important, but in the future it's going to be how do we create totally innovative and transformative ideas, products, and services, and that's going to be done very differently than we've done it in the past.
So I want, Neil, for you now, somebody who is based in Washington, D.C., who has been involved in the political space, in the policy space, and now in the academic space, recognizing that what is happening with this network of community college, we really don't have like 15 years to take it from what they call like prototyping that they're doing to really making it global. So these ideas that you have in your book around transformational learning and creating global innovation networks. Now, can this university, can the network that you're creating around universities as centers to hopefully make this paradigm move much faster? The ideas you have in your book about holistic thinking and, you know, creative molecular economy and people, you really have to get the book and look at it and sort of get more in-depth knowledge about what they're talking about. But how would you use the space of Washington, D.C., where we have so many international organizations, so many NGOs doing international work, to sort of more hastily, the fact that we have a global march taking place in Washington, D.C., how can we use these spaces, such as these marches, to sort of see these ideas and use what is happening that's been happening in the networks to ramp up much faster? How do you think that could happen with, for example, using your campus as a part of this network?
Well, I think there's an excellent opportunity for the University of the District of Columbia and the UDC Community College to be really centers of thinking and thought leadership. Again, the community college is about 7 years old. I was part of the founding team that created it. And it's gone through a lot of leadership changes since its inception. It's just now getting to the place where it's in a its foundation is set, and we begin building more complex structures within the institution. You know, with any kind of system or any kind of organization or business, it goes through life cycles. And the life cycle and focus of the community college up until now was just getting its accreditation set, getting its programming put in place. We're just now, after, again, 7 years, really in this place where we can begin infusing some of these ideas into the university and the community college. Those conversations are just beginning now. But in a larger sense, there's a lot of things happening in the District of Columbia that's connected to some of these ideas. Last month, I taught for a week at Georgetown University, and they've got a fantastic program called the Institute for Transformational Learning. And I taught a master's degree class based using Rick and my book as the focus. And it was a tremendous, we received a tremendous response from the students and from the university. I think it's going to become a regular course, regular set of instruction for Georgetown. I think when you get institutions like that ready to embrace these ideas, and Georgetown is it's at the front of higher education in a lot of ways, not only because it's always been known for being a pretty high-end, stellar academic institution, but it's also been through a reflective moment where they've had to come to grips of their past, where they just recently recognized that their role in history was selling some slaves back in the 1830s. That kind of thinking is actually transformational because they're not trying to gloss over the past. They're taking these new ideas and putting them into practice. And I can tell you that a lot of folks at Georgetown are using the book for context.
I'm very glad to hear that because one of the things I'm concerned about, and Rick, you're in the South, is like, for example, that if you remove a statue, a Confederate flag, you're removing the actual, for example, issue of racism. I'm like, you all need to leave the flag there and put up a sign that explains why the flag is there and why it's no longer there, as opposed to removing the flag, because that doesn't really have to do with the transformational jump. I want to move now from the issue of education as a space to a very exciting idea that your book also deals with, because as we look at this concept of climate change, we look at the challenge of the issue of the people who don't believe in climate change, people who do believe in climate change, and the fact that we really are at a crux of important shift in humanity, and the fact that your ideas about bringing new thoughts like the creative molecular economy into being is really tied into this issue of sustainability. And so how would you help us think about, as we look at climate change on one hand, the future of sustainability and the creative molecular economy, can you explain to us a little bit more about how thinking about the economy in a new way and teaching about it in a new way and getting it rapidly into the mindset of the people in political power, the people in the financial power, people in the policy space, that we can get this idea more understood so it can hopefully move from just an idea in a book to being in practice. So tell us a little more about the creative molecular economy. You want to take that?
Well,
yeah.
Would you like for, those are a great series of questions, Claire. Would you like for me to answer them in the next 3 or 4 hours?
No, you only have like 5 minutes in total to cover this question, because I want to come back to something else in our last 5 minutes. So let's see if we get, because I want to also hear Neil's perspective, because you're coming from a smaller focus, where Neil is in a bigger city where all these global things are also being done. So I want to hear the answer from both perspectives.
Sure. Let me just, I'll spend about a minute and a half just giving you a framework of what I think.
Yes.
First of all, the very nature of the shift and transformation from the industrial age, whatever you want to call it. We borrowed from a good friend of ours out in California, John's concept of ecological civilization. Mm-hmm. The reason I bring this up is that when you get people to think about things differently, they will respond usually in one of four ways if they're resisting change. They'll say, show me where it's worked is one comment. They'll say, give me something practical. They'll say, use language we can understand, or they'll say, give me the model that we can replicate. Now, all four of those ideas are ideas that come from the industrial age and strategic planning. And in my opinion, it's just an opinion, Claire, that none of those four are appropriate, because to be transformative and to actually have a new type of economy that is going to be highly entrepreneurial at the core, and it will take some years to let that evolve, because in effect, we're still focusing on recruiting jobs from other places. Now, that idea has been around for 50 years, and it worked very well as long as there was an economy that was focused on the concept of jobs as the core idea. Now, that will still be around for years. But we are seeing the early stages, the weak signals, if you will, in our opinion, and why we wrote the chapter in the book on the creative molecular economy, that we're going to be building networks of individuals and smaller organizations, as you would in nature, to develop networks of entrepreneurs. And that will be able to adapt more quickly. When you have a large organization like General Motors that almost went out of business, you can't adapt quickly. In the future, change is going to come so rapidly that we're really going to need to have the ability to be able to have an economy that adapts very quickly. It will require a new type of workforce. It will require a workforce that's open to new ideas, connects with each other, adapts quickly, and moves on to the next thing. And so we believe that in the future, that the whole concept of the way the educational system evolves and develops, and the way in which it connects into a new approach to the workforce, and the way in which then leadership understands how to design, facilitate that, was going to be more systems. In other words, and Neil mentioned the word systems, that if you have new approaches that are going to be moving so quickly, then you need to establish some kind of parallel effort that complements what's going on at the moment, so you can begin to have people think about the future in different ways. That's why I brought up about going back 25 years, so that people that already see it occurring can realize that in the early stages, there really wasn't a lot of people that understood that. So the idea of a creative molecular economy is going to be very different than an industrial age economy. We'll still have jobs. It'll be and both. There'll be a lot of jobs. But we're going to have the type of technologies that are emerging and occurring now, to include the ones I mentioned, that are going to converge. And there's a futurist out in Colorado who's head of the Da Vinci Institute, a fellow well-known internationally named Thomas Fry. And for the last year and a half, he's been going around the world suggesting that by the year 2030, we're going to have 2 billion jobs lost in the country, in the world. So we're in a different age. And I'll turn it over to Neil.
Well, I was just gonna, in maybe more practical sense, here in Washington, D.C., and a lot of urban areas, what we're already experiencing is the early stages of this creative molecular economy. We're seeing it in the sharing economy that is, evolving. We've got Airbnb, we've got Uber taxis, which are allowing people, both these two examples are allowing people to be business owners, to have maybe a second or third job. I think one of the things we're going to see shifting in the future is that we're going to have a collection of skills that we're all going to be able to make money on. We might not go to a job for 40 hours a week, and we're certainly not going to be going to a factory, most of us doing it. But the underlying, the sharing economy, though, is another big shift that's connected to the creative molecular economy, and that's a shift from the thought of materialism to the thought of happiness is going to evolve from something else than ownership. So instead of having the biggest car and the biggest house and the best toys and things, we're going to start finding, I believe, more enjoyment and more embracing of creativity, of art, of things that we can do together as people. I think we're going to, instead of owning cars, we're going to be sharing them. Instead of owning a lawnmower, on your block, you're going to be sharing the lawnmower. I think that shift is going to have huge implications on the economy, and I'm looking forward to it.
I certainly think we need to think about that because, quite frankly, we're running out of landfill. So we only have about 5 minutes left, and I want to jump into something very important because of, you know, this idea with all these elections around the world, with Brexit, with the snap election being called in London, with the French election being like have on everybody's tongue. And you also talk about the emergence of polycentric democracy and mobile collaborative governance. And I really enjoyed this conversation when, or in your book, when Principle 2 said republicanism and the common good. And I thought, interesting, because you say here, and you're quoting from somebody else, that the word republic means the public good or the good of the whole, in contradiction to the despotic form, which means the good of the sovereign or one man or the object of government. And you talk about this idea that republicanism is probably one of the most misunderstood constructs in current American policy. So tell us about this idea of polycentric democracy as we begin to close down. Rick?
Well, Claire, let me throw that over to Neil, and let me hitchhike on what Neil's calls. Neil, who used to be Deputy Chief of Staff of the City of Washington.
It's true, I probably should ask him that one because he's more involved in politics than you are. So Rick, you're in DC, you know the issues with statehood and not statehood and a right to vote and a right not to vote. What is polycentric democracy?
Polycentric democracy is really organic democracy. It's, it's literally complex adaptive systems of people and networks who want to have their voice included in decision making. Fundamentally, what it's trying to build is trust, authenticity, and inclusion. And those are things that I think that we're hearing voters both locally here in the District of Columbia and local elections, but also nationally. They don't feel like the political parties and the media and elected leaders are folks that inspire them. So polycentric democracy is a system whereby you can get people more involved in policy making and being involved in government at different levels. Here in Washington, D.C., we used a process called the Citizen Summit during the Mayor Anthony Williams administration, which built on a lot of these ideas of polycentric democracy and also what we, Rick and I, call mobile collaborative governance, in that we use technology. Almost everyone now certainly has access to computers and access to ideas. It's much easier, and we need to find ways to put together policy teams of interested citizens who have an interest in public safety or transportation. Let them work with policy experts within government and within community-based organizations to come up with solutions. If you have top-down ideas that are just being flooded down on people, that may or may not make sense, they may be a great idea, they don't tend to really inspire the public, particularly a public that wants to be more involved, in policy ideas and shaping the future of their community. So polycentric democracy has within it systems to involve folks, so you can use technology and facilitated dialogues, which is how we use it here in the District of Columbia.
I want to kind of jump quickly into something else. Is this something that could, because we have a global issue like Earth Day, for example, we know that there's simply some systems which are global. So it sounds good and fine for local problems, but right now the challenges we face at humanity are planetary system failure. So it means that we have to find a way to have that experiment of polycentric democracy still being tied into the global goals, such as my passion is the sustainable development goals. And the hope for me is to have local communities all focus on how they can improve their experience to fit into the global goals. How can we begin to conceptualize an experiment in polycentric democracy in maybe 10 different communities in America around, let's say, a national issue? Maybe could be water, for example, or in DC where we have DC, Maryland, Virginia, and it's really already a nexus of a city, how can we probably ramp up very quickly an experiment where this is happening in all the counties surrounding DC, and we pick one issue and maybe try and test it out, if you will, in a short frame to also have that being copied in other major areas, London and Berlin, wherever you have these cities, complexes which are also, regional hubs.
Well, I think, bringing together communities, we've got to figure out that we've got to find consensus in what people are really thinking about. And as you said in the setup for this part of the talk, some people believe in climate change and they believe that we're in a crisis, and you have some people that don't. I think most people, certainly, all the scientists that are much smarter about this than I am, all believe that the climate and the earth is in a really precarious place. But first, if you're going to bring in communities to talk about really complex issues like this, first you have to have a series of conversations reaching consensus and understanding about what that community represents. Because if you got 51% of the people thinking one thing and 49% of the other, it's not going to work. I'm going to let Rick talk in a minute, but I think underneath the sustainability issue, particularly thinking about Earth Day, one of the things that we've got to do, along with having these dialogues and finding consensus, which will be a lot educational as well, is humanity's got to stop thinking about the Earth as an other, as a thing outside of themselves. The Earth is connected to us. We are part of the ecosystem, and I think as long as we have this either or mentality where the Earth is just this outer thing that we walk on, as we get our shoes dirty, we're not going to realize the intimate relationship we have with the Earth, and therefore the possibility that we could be damaging it with the way that we exist. So for me, along with having community dialogue and having polycentric democracy, there's got to be a much larger shift with how we think about the Earth.
Let me ask you a question, Rick. We are talking about systems change and transformational learning. And one of the things you propose in your book is this idea of master capacity builders and master capacity builders for communities. So we think about the Sustainable Development Goals for 2030, the goals around environment, the goals around inequality, ocean. There's so many goals around jobs, for example. How is there a goal or a headline that you might see as we look at what we're doing now, the fact that your book has come out a good 13 years before we have to get to a goal? Is there something that the Committees of the Futures can put forward as a aspirational futures headline that we might plug into to self-organize to get to that? Is there some headline you have in mind of an accomplishment that you would have achieved as a result of getting some of the ideas of this book into more common usage?
I like your thought, Claire. I think there are a number of different headlines that pop into my mind, but just to get the phrase community of the future into the thinking of individuals, that if I was writing a lead line for a newspaper or in the year 2030, probably won't have newspapers around. It'll be all on the website. But it would be something to the effect of 20 communities in 20 states designated as communities of the future because of their, and then subtitles that would be focused on different aspects of the ideas that we're talking about in the book. Focus on master capacity builder. We coined that term, Claire, because of the fact that if you're going to have the ability to have people shift over into new ways of thinking, for instance, into new paradigms of thinking, then the old methodologies of leadership based on strategic planning, where you set the outcomes and know exactly what's going to happen, and then determine what the best practices are to get there and hold people accountable and then test out whether you've made it or not, that'll be fine as far as the next 2 or 3 years when everything's defined. If you're going to build a building or a dam or agricultural products, processes that you're going to develop. But if you're looking to shift the way people think, like Neil and I are focusing on and our network of community of the future, And if you're going to build new capacities for not just thinking but action in new ways for true transformation, defined as challenging the underlying assumptions of how we look at economic development or how we look at leadership or education or whatever, then building those capacities is done very differently than building the concepts of a project that is very concrete and tangible. And we find that you, in effect, can build networks of people and have them share with each other and have them ask each other questions. Let me give you a specific example of one of the newest ideas on which we're working that ties into what you're talking about. That there is in the United States, probably the group of communities that are struggling the most are smaller communities under 25,000. And so we believe that there's a need to build a network of leaders from different communities that are interested in comparing ideas, thinking about the future in new ways, and learning new skills and techniques for leadership that helps people shift into new ways of thinking and action. And so therefore, we're developing an idea called the national, or because Canada's going to be involved now, the International Smaller Community Transforming Network. And they're going to be people from 10 communities in the states. We've already got 5 committed in terms of individuals that will be a part of a design team. And then the same thing will happen up in Canada. We already have an individual from Chestermere, Canada, and Calgary, outside of Calgary in Alberta province. And those individuals, those 20 individuals, will collaborate with us, and we will then think about how do you have community transformation? How do you seed and build capacities for new ways of thinking in all of these areas that you're bringing up? And in doing so, then what will happen is, and Neil used the term complex adaptive system about 30 minutes ago, that as opposed to predicting what you're going to have 10 years from now or 5 years from now, which isn't possible in a constantly changing, exponentially complex society and economy, what you can do, though, is you can build networks of people, organization, ideas, and have them work and collaborate together at a deeper level around these concepts and new approaches. It's all research and development. See what works and doesn't work, feed it back, and then slowly but surely you have tipping points where different communities are identified in different ways or different ideas, and then you share with each other over the internet. So it's going to be, in our opinion, a very different approach to the way you lead in the future. Will you still have times when you, in effect, use specific strategic planning and specific ideas on a time frame? Absolutely. At the same time, using our principle of and both, there'll be another parallel effort of building these kind of networks and building the connections and sharing ideas around these new and emerging concepts, then have core groups of people in different places of a community or different states, different communities in different states, and work with them and work on these new ideas. And that's the way every new idea that is a part of that book, Claire, emerged over the last 25 years. So it's going to be a different world in this ecological civilization, and we're not prepared for it. But there are more and more people like you and others, and all of us together can collaborate, and hopefully we will, in effect, then be in a position where we can help our children and grandchildren prepare and be sustainable and vital for a totally new future of a society and economy that's just in the early stages of emerging.
I think we have run out of time and have come to an end. So Neil, I want to ask you, as we think about preparing for a world that doesn't exist yet, and this idea of creating a new paradigm, are you, because as we know, social change theory says we need 10% of a community believing the same thing. So when you told the headline of 20 communities in 20 states, I'm actually more aggressively thinking about how I can get this to 700,000 people or 700 million people in the next 10 years, because that's what it takes to change 7 billion people. So Neil, as we close out, one word, if you will, and my word choice is, are you optimistic, are you pessimistic, or are you neutralistic, that if a lot of us kind of use the fervency of today's movements, the climate change movement, we can begin to prepare more people for a world that doesn't exist yet and make ourselves into a thriving, sustainable society in the year 2030 and beyond? One word, which is it?
Optimistic.
Rick, one word, which is it?
Very optimistic.
Well,
Words.
That's 2 words. So, folks,
Well,
you have it.
that
That's
was very cool and cool,
I
Claire.
want to thank my guests, Smyre and RIchardson, who are authors of this wonderful book, Preparing for a World That Doesn't Exist Yet, for their work, and invite you to continue watching out for people who are making sense of the tension of the distance and challenges between past and present and the future that doesn't exist yet. Thank you for listening, and good.
You have been listening to
Bye.
Future
Walk
Sense
good.
Now with Dr.
Safe
Claire
journey.
Nelson, brought to you by the Futures Forum. For more, please visit www.thefuturesforum.org. Thank you for listening. Spread the word. Share the future.